A lot of businesses think their call to action is clear. There's a button, schedule a consultation, book a call, contact us, get started. From the business side, that feels simple. The next step is right there. But from the buyer's side, that button may not feel simple because clicking it changes the relationship. They're no longer just researching, they're no longer anonymous. It's like they're raising their hand in class to be called on. They're inviting a conversation. They may be opening the door to follow up questions, sales pressure, or a decision they don't feel ready to make yet. This episode is about the black box, the part of the buying process that begins after someone reaches out, but before they understand what that fully means. For high trust businesses, this matters because the buyer is usually not just evaluating the service, they're evaluating the experience of becoming a prospect. What happens if I fill out this form? Who am I going to talk to? What are they going to ask me? Will I be pressured? Do I need to be ready to buy? What happens if I'm just exploring? What happens if I'm not a fit? What if this becomes awkward? Those questions may sound small, but they create hesitation. And hesitation is one of the easiest things for a business to misread. Because even when someone hesitates, they usually don't explain it to you. They don't send a message that says, "Oh, I was interested, but I could not tell what would happen after I reached out, so I disappeared into the internet." They just leave. And from the business side, that can look like a lead problem, but it may be a process clarity problem. I'll explain my perspective here. I build documentary style film systems for high trust businesses, so I spend a lot of time thinking about what a buyer needs to understand before the first real conversation. Not just what they need to know after the call, but before the call, before the inquiry, before they make themselves visible to the business. That's the part I care about because in a lot of serious decisions, the buyer is already deciding before the business ever knows they exist. They are reading, comparing, asking around, looking for proof, trying to understand the people, trying to picture the process, trying to decide whether taking the next step feels worth it. So when I talk about process clarity, I'm not talking about making a cute how it works section. I'm talking about reducing the uncertainty around the first step. That can be done in writing, it can be done in a conversation, it can be done through a referral, it can be done through a process page. Sometimes it can be done very clearly through film, but the medium is not the point. The point is whether the buyer can understand enough to move forward. Here's the mistake. Most businesses understand their own process so well that they forget what it feels like from the outside. Internally, the first step is obvious. You know what happens after someone reaches out. You know who responds. You know what the first call is like. You know what questions you ask. You know how you evaluate fit. You know whether the call is low pressure. You know what happens if the person's not ready. You know what comes next. But the buyer does not know any of that. They see schedule a consultation, and then they have to imagine the rest. There's an input, contact us. There's an output, maybe working together. But the part in between is unclear, and when that part is unclear, the buyer fills in the blanks. And people don't always fill in the blanks with the most generous version. They may imagine pressure, they may imagine confusion, they may imagine a sales call, they may imagine being asked questions they cannot answer yet. Even if the business is credible and even if the buyer is interested, the next step can still feel heavier than the business realizes. This matters more when the decision carries weight. If someone is buying a pair of socks, they don't need a documentary about the sock onboarding process. They need the socks to exist and fit and not kill their ankles. Low stakes purchases can tolerate ambiguity. High trust decisions can't. If someone is choosing a wealth advisor, an estate attorney, a custom builder, a consultant, a senior care provider, a private school, or specialty healthcare practice, the list goes on, the first step feels different. They may be dealing with money, family, a legal issue, home, business, parent, health concern, a future decision that has consequences. So reaching out doesn't feel like clicking a button. It feels like entering a process. And if that process is unclear, they may slow down, not because they're uninterested, but because they're trying to avoid stepping into something they don't understand. That is normal. We all do this. The more important the decision, the more the buyer wants to know what they're walking into. This is why a clear process can reduce friction before the first conversation, not by explaining every possible detail. That'd be miserable. Nobody needs a 47-step diagram of your entire internal workflow. The buyer doesn't need everything. They need enough. enough to know what the first step is for, enough to know who they'll be talking to, enough to know they need to prepare, enough to know what they'll need to prepare, enough to know whether they are expected to be ready to buy, what happens if it's not a fit, enough to know they can start the conversation without being trapped inside a sales machine. That is what process clarity does. It lowers the perceived cost of reaching out. Reaching out does have a cost. It costs time, it costs attention, it creates exposure, it may require the buyer to explain something personal or financial or operational or complicated. It may start a relationship they're not sure they want yet. So the first step needs to feel understandable enough to take. Not perfect, not completely risk-free, just clear enough. There's another reason this matters. Process is not just information, process is proof. A clear process tells the buyer something about the business. It says, we have guided people through this before. We know what questions matter. We know where people usually feel uncertain. We know how to start without overwhelming you. We have a way to move from confusion to clarity. That matters because in high trust businesses, the buyer is not hiring the business because they already know exactly what to do. They are hiring the business because they need guidance. So the process itself becomes evidence of competence, of organization, of judgment, evidence that the business knows how to handle the first conversation without making the buyer feel stupid or rushed or lost. That is why process clarity is not just an operations detail, it's part of the trust building experience. A business can say, we guide our clients carefully. That's fine, but if the buyer can't see how the guidance begins, that claim is abstract. A clear process makes it more real. This is also why some businesses are stronger in person than they are before the first call. Once you sit with them, the experience makes sense. They ask good questions, they explain things clearly and carefully, they are patient, but the buyer only gets to that version after they decide to reach out. And if the pre-contact experience doesn't give them enough confidence, they may never reach that part. They may never reach the part where the business is actually the strongest. And that's frustrating. The business may be excellent. The first call may be great. The service may be strong. The client experience may be the thing that makes people stay for years. But if the process is invisible before contact, the buyer has to take a leap of faith just to find that out. Some buyers will, some buyers won't, especially if the decision is important and they have other options that feel easier to understand. That doesn't mean those other options are better. It means they're easier to understand and easier to enter. And sometimes easier to enter wins. A lot of businesses try to solve this with more persuasion. They add more claims, more benefits, more language about being trusted, experienced, personal, strategic, or different. But if the buyer's real hesitation is, I don't know what happens next, then more praise doesn't solve that. The problem is not that the buyer needs another reason to admire the business. The problem is that they need a clearer picture of what happens next. That is a totally different fix. The business doesn't need to shout louder. It needs to make the path more visible. What happens after I reach out? What is the first conversation actually for? Is this a sales call or a fit call? How long does it usually take? Who will I be speaking with? What should I have ready? What happens after the call? What if now is not the right time? What if I'm not the right fit? Answering those questions doesn't weaken the sales process. It strengthens it because a buyer who understands the first step is more likely to take it. This is where a lot of process films can be useful, and I want to define that plainly. A process film is a short video that explains what happens when someone works with the business, especially what happens after the first point of contact. It is a clear explanation of the relationship, who the business helps, what the first step looks like, how the business evaluates fit, what the early conversations are for, how the process usually unfolds, what the buyer should expect, and that can be very useful because the buyer isn't just reading the steps, they are hearing the tone, they are seeing the person, they are getting a sense of how the business explains. They are deciding whether the process feels guided and reasonable and clear. Again, this does not mean every process explanation has to be with a video. A written process page is better than nothing if it is clear. But for high-trust businesses, there are parts of the process that can be easier to understand when the buyer can hear someone explain it directly. The way a person explains the first conversation can reduce hesitation. The way they talk about fit can reduce pressure. The way they describe the steps can make the unknown feel less vague. That is where film can help, not because it's prettier, but because it can make the next step easier to picture. But the process film should not try to explain everything. That is where businesses can overcorrect. They go from vague to exhausting. The goal is not to give a buyer a complete operating manual. The goal is to answer the questions that are most likely creating hesitation. A good process explanation should usually answer a few basic things. Who is this for? What happens after someone reaches out? What is the first conversation meant to accomplish? What should the buyer prepare, if anything? How does the business decide whether there's a fit? What does the relationship usually look like once work begins? What happens if the business is not the right fit? And that last one matters because a lot of buyers hesitate because they don't want a conversation where the only acceptable ending is buying. If the business can say clearly and calmly that the first conversation is about understanding fit, that can lower the pressure, especially in high trust categories. The buyer may not need to know every detail. They need to know that they can start without being cornered. Process clarity also helps referrals. A referral can get someone interested, but the referred person still has to decide whether to take the next step. If the referrer says, "Oh, you should talk to them," that helps. But if the referred person then lands on a website where the next step is incredibly vague, they may still hesitate. A strong referral handoff gives them context. Here's who they are. Here's how they think. Here's what happens when you reach out. Here is what the first conversation is like. Here is why clients trust them. That is a much better experience than forcing the referrer to explain the whole business from memory, which they usually will not do well. Not because they don't care or they don't know, but because they're not your sales department. They are just a person sending a name. The business still has to support the handoff. That is one of the jobs of process clarity. It gives a referred buyer something to understand before they commit to the conversation. The placement of process clarity matters too. It should not be buried. If the buyer is deciding whether to contact you, the explanation of what happens should be near the place where that decision happens. That might be the homepage. It might be a service page. It might be a start here page. It may be a referral follow-up email. It may be a pre-call email. It may be used in an introduction from a client, attorney, a CPA, a consultant, or advisor. The point is simple. Put process clarity where hesitation happens. Do not hide it in 3 pages deep and then wonder why people still ask basic questions on the first call. If the same questions keep coming up early, that is a signal. If people keep asking, how does this work, or what happens first, or who do I talk to, what do I need to bring, then some of that clarity probably belongs upstream. Not all of it. The first conversation still matters, but the first conversation should not have to rebuild the entire front half of their relationship from scratch. This is also why the process film is only one part of the system. A process film answers one important question: what happens if I reach out? But that is not the only thing that the buyer is trying to understand. They also want to know, who are these people? That is the job of the brand film. They want to know, has someone like me trusted them and been glad they did? That is the job of the client stories film. They want to know what happens next. And that is the job of the process film. Those are different questions. And when those questions are answered together, the buyer gets a clearer path. They are not just being told the business is credible. They are being shown how to evaluate it, who the business is, how the relationship starts, what the experience looks like from the client side. That is the system. Not 3 videos for the sake of 3 videos, but 3 assets answering 3 different parts of the buyer's uncertainty. So here's the practical question. Can a serious buyer picture what happens after they reach out? Not every detail, not the whole relationship, just the next step. Can they understand what the first conversation is for? Can they tell whether they are expected to be ready to buy? Can they see how your business guides people? Can they understand what happens if there's not a fit? Can they move from private research to a real conversation without feeling like they're stepping into a black box? If the answer is no, that may be one of the reasons people hesitate. Not because they're unqualified and not because they were never interested in the first place, but because the next step just felt unclear. And when the next step is unclear, waiting feels safer than reaching out. And that is the problem. At KBT Films, I build documentary-style film systems for high-trust businesses. One part of that system is the process film. Its job is to make the next step visible before the first conversation. The brand film explains who the business is. The process film explains how the relationship starts and works. And the client stories film shows what the experience looked like from the client's side. Together, they help a serious buyer understand enough to take the next step with more context. If you want to see what that looks like, start with the Peoples & Co. case study at kbtfilms.com. Watch what each film is doing. The question is not just whether they look good, but the question is whether they help the buyer understand the people, the proof, and the process before the first series conversation. For high trust businesses, that is where a lot of the decision begins.